Tom, I'm excited that we can show the strange demise of Jim Crow to Covenant. And I thought everyone would be interested in knowing how you became the creator and executive producer of this film. How did it start?
I was a junior faculty member at UTMB in Galveston. I was in the Humanities Institute, and I was responsible for providing historical comments in psychiatry. And one day, the patient came down from the hospital who was psychotic, manic depressive African-American, who said he had been the Houston civil rights leader. And everybody just chalked it up to grandiosity, flight of ideas. And he had come into the emergency room having tried to circumcise himself with a razor. Nobody asked the question, why? What would be the significance of that? Well, it turns out he had a German Jewish ancestor. He was trying to figure out who he was. So I went upstairs to the hospital unit and told him I was fascinated by his story. Would he consider working with me? He was trying to finish a book. And he looked at me and tried to size me up, you know. He said, since I'm a Jew, I trust, you know, since you're a Jew, I trust you, he said. So we started working on his book, which was going to be an autobiography, but he just couldn't pull it off. And so after I started to understand his biography, born in Galveston, mixed race parents, spent time in East Texas on a semi plantation with relatives. Kind of became a natural kind of preacher. Went to TSU, became a lawyer, and fell apart and was living on the streets for many, many years. So when I asked him about the desegregation of Houston and his role in the sit-in movements, which he started, he couldn't tell a coherent story. So I had to work with him and let him, encourage him to let me be the writer, which was a very difficult negotiation. But finally, he said okay to that. And then I realized that I couldn't get the real story of desegregation unless I went up to Houston and started interviewing people, especially student colleagues of his. So I began doing that. I got close to finishing this book about him and desegregation, and I realized, which is called the No Colors My Kind, I realized there was no real film, no documentary film on desegregation in Houston. And I realized it was so different than in the Deep South that it really deserved to be told. I had no experience as a filmmaker. I just had a commitment to finding a way to tell the story. And I went to David Berman, who we both know really well. David Berman was a neighbor of mine for a year when I moved to Houston. And we just got to know each other well. I knew he made commercials, but he was kind of slow. The work was slow there. And he just agreed. And I just started doing interviews, starting with Quentin Meese. And he brought the cameraman and the lighting, and he did the direction. And so we began mostly with students and then with journalists and businessmen. And it was a very exciting story, but I couldn't tell it coherently. I could tell it coherently as a writer, but as a filmmaker, I had no experience. And so we were stuck. I was stuck.
Well, how long had this taken up to this point, from the first meeting El Druy to getting to work with David and start the interviews?
Probably 7 years.
Wow.
And then it took fundraising and probably 2.5 more years to get it done. And you were a crucial part of coming on board and making this happen. I mean, why don't you tell the story of how you got involved and what your role was and is, and how we got to know each other.
I think that's something for the end of the film, part of the discussion, that piece there. I just wanted to go back to one point at the beginning, back at the medical school. You were in the room with with Eldrewey Stearns in an exam room or a clinic room of some sort, and you were with were you with a group of
A group of students.
students? And what was their response? Because usually the what's it called? The attending is trying to get the students to make a diagnosis, right?
Yes, the interviewer was a psychiatrist who was interviewing him in order to come up with a diagnosis. And that's what the students were trying to do, inclusion and exclusion criteria. And I just said, you know, there's a story here. You don't know what this story is. This man is not just psychotic. He had a life.